Lincoln supposedly, as a young man, wrote a whole book disputing scripture. And of course, when he got into politics, he apparently got some good advice. You better burn that book, Abe, if you want to be in politics. And so he became very good, as you all know, in quoting the Bible to make people think that his policies were God's will, although he himself was never, his wife, according to his wife and his law partner, who was probably the person who closest to him of all people in the world, William Herndon, said that he was never a believer, never hardly ever stepped into a church, and disputed scripture. And so that's who he was. And so I thought my second topic this year is the 100th anniversary of the Lincoln Memorial. Hold your applause, please. Hold your applause, please. Okay, so I thought, and I've written something about it, and I thought it would be an interesting topic to compare Jefferson and Lincoln, since they both have big memorials in Washington, D.C. And my wife likes to watch the 4th of July fireworks on TV, and so on the 4th of July, sit there. But I was sitting there. It was kind of disgusting to me because they kept showing the Lincoln Memorial in the fireworks and everything like that. But I just bit my tongue and I sat through it. But what I'm going to start is there's I have an association with the Mises Institute in Auburn, Alabama. It's MISES. It's named after a famous 20th century economist and sociologist named with a tongue-twisting name of Ludwig von Mises. Ludwig, he was Austrian. He was Austrian and he was Jewish, and he was chased down by the Nazis, and he left his apartment in Vienna just hours before the Gestapo broke in and took all of his things, his writings, manuscripts, and everything like that. And he and his wife wandered around Europe for a while and somehow made it onto a boat and ended up in New York City in the 1930s. And so he was notorious because, one, he was the preeminent critic of socialism in general, and especially of Nazism, of Nazi Germany. He was Austrian, okay, and he was Jewish, and so he had to get out of town. And he ended up at NYU, and an American businessman funded his position at New York University until he died in 1973. And he taught a couple generations of students there, and he wrote many famous books. He has Human Action is his most famous book, and the one I'm going to talk about, though, that von Mises wrote. And another interesting aspect of this, after the collapse of communism, when researchers could go into Moscow and dig around the KGB files in the 1990, 91, 92, an old friend of mine, Richard Ebeling, who teaches at the Citadel now, by the way, he went over there, and he has a Russian wife, and they went over there, as did other people, and they found the papers of Ludwig von Mises. And so the Gestapo took tender, loving care of these things during the war, because after all, he was like, enemy number one as far as ideologically. And then when the Russians came in to Berlin, they got these papers, and they certainly knew who Mises was, because he also published a famous book in 1922 called Socialism, which was a big fat book explaining why socialism could never work as an economic system, which turned out to be exactly true, of course. And so the Soviets took tender, loving care of Ludwig von Mises' writings, and Richard Ebeling and others got them, and they're all been published. The things that weren't published, they're all on, they originally put them all on discs and so forth, so they were recovered. It's kind of an interesting story about him. But he wrote a book called Nation, State, and Economy. And this is one of the reasons, by the way, why the Mises Institute 25 or so years ago published a book on secession that Clyde Wilson has a chapter in it. I have a chapter in it. Clyde was there at that conference. It was it might have been the first time I met Clyde. They actually had an essay contest on the topic of secession, and I was one of the winners of the essay contest. I wrote my paper called Yankee Confederates about the New England secession movement that preceded the Southern secession movement by several decades. And that's in this book on secession. But in this book, Nation, State, and Economy, Mises says this. He uses early 20th century, late 19th century language. So he talks about what he calls a princely state, a government, princely state versus a free state. He says the princely state is one in which the people are not citizens but subjects. Okay, and the purpose of the princely state is the more land and more subjects, the more revenue and the more soldiers. So the people are looked at as taxpayers and cannon fodder. Sound familiar to modern day America? And he says, only in the size of the state does assurance of its preservation lie. Smaller states are always in danger of being swallowed up by larger ones. Okay. By contrast, in a free state, he said, there are no conquests, no annexations, and a free state forces no one against his will into the structure of the state. Okay, that's something that Jefferson Davis would agree with. I would think would have agreed with. So he actually supported secession. Now, on the topic of secession, he said this in the book Nation, State, and Economy: when a part of the people of the state wants to drop out of the Union, liberalism, he's talking about the philosophy of freedom, liberalism, not Ted Kennedy liberalism, but classical liberalism. Okay, liberalism does not hinder it from doing so. Colonies that want to become independent need only to do so. That's the free state. Okay, so I think that's a neat distinction to make. The princely state, you could call it something else, but versus the free state. And so I compare this paper that I'm reading from is something I wrote for the Mises Institute, and I'm just going to read from a part of it. And I compared Jefferson and Lincoln in terms of these two categories, the princely state and the free state. And of course, Jefferson, is probably one of his most famous lines is, government's just powers are derived from the consent of the governed. He says that in the Declaration of Independence. Not the whims of politicians, okay, not the authority of politicians, but the consent of the governed. In his first inaugural address, Jefferson said this: if there be any among us who would wish to dissolve the Union, let them stand undisturbed as monuments of the safety with which error of opinion may be tolerated where reason is left free to combat it. And I see that as a defense not only of free speech, but of the voluntary union and secession. And when you look at what Lincoln said, later on, it's radically different. And another thing that Jefferson said, besides that, there's a letter he wrote to Dr. Joseph Priestley, January 29th, 1804, and this is when the New England Federalists were plotting to secede. And they held a secession convention in Hartford, Connecticut in 1814, and eventually they decided against it because from what I've read about it, the main reason for deciding against it was they were worried that they wouldn't have very lucrative political careers in this new confederation, and so they stuck with the old one, and they probably decided, well, we can just plunder the South, instead. Let's take that route, and instead of enriching ourselves in our own country, why should we plunder our own fellow New Englanders when we can plunder Southerners instead? After all, we're going to outvote them pretty soon. That's me talking. I'm not quoting anybody. That's my interpretation. That's my surmise of what they must have been thinking. But in his letter, so this Dr. Joseph Priestley writes Jefferson asking him, what do you think about this New England secession movement? Here's what Jefferson said: whether we remain in one confederacy or form into Atlantic and Mississippi confederacies, that is the East Coast, Eastern Seaboard, New York, the Delaware, the eastern seaboard versus the South, Mississippi, I believe not very important to the happiness of either part. Those of the Western Confederacy will be as much our children and descendants as those of the Eastern, and I feel myself as much identified with that country in future time as with this. And did I now foresee a separation? They didn't use the word secession, they call it separation, at some future day, yet I should feel the duty and the desire to promote the Western interest as zealously as the Eastern interest, doing all the good for both portions of our future family, which should fall within my power. So Jefferson thought all these Americans would be part of our family, whether they separate into different confederacies or not. And he would do everything he could within his power to help them out to live a good life. Okay. Another letter kind of similar to John C. Breckinridge. There are several Breckinridges in 19th century history involved in politics, asking about the same thing. He was it's not the exact same thing. He was asking about the Louisiana Purchase, and again, that one of the reasons why the New England Federalists were plotting secession is they hated the Louisiana Purchase because they thought of themselves as God's chosen people, and all these hordes of Catholics and others from Europe were coming in through Louisiana and elsewhere, and they didn't want to have anything to do with that. And so that was one of the reasons they gave for why they were thinking about seceding and creating their own country. Okay, and so John C. Breckinridge asked him about it, and Jefferson said, if there's a separation, he said, quote, God bless them both and keep them in the Union if it be for their good, but separate them if it be better. So that was Jefferson. That's his ideas on secession all through his life. This was 1804 that he wrote this. And one of my all-time favorite quotes from Jefferson, just not related to secession, the first inaugural. For years I've been thinking, I got to just type this up and put it on a plaque on my wall somewhere. He said, a wise and frugal government which shall restrain men from injuring one another, shall leave them otherwise free to regulate their own pursuits of industry and improvement, and shall not take from the mouth of labor the bread it has earned. This is the sum of good government, and it is necessary to close the circle of our felicities. So that's not the princely state there. That's an articulation of the free state concept that Ludwig von Mises is talking about. Okay, the maximum freedom. Okay, that's very classical liberal philosophy. So that's a few statements about Jefferson's opinion about the princely state versus the free state that would allow separation, secession. Now on to Lincoln. What I'm going to say about this regarding Lincoln is that the Lincoln Memorial. When I was doing the research for my latest book, The Problem with Lincoln, I ran across a publication by the National Park Service called The Secret Symbol of the Lincoln Memorial. It's online. You can read it yourself if you want to. The Secret Symbol of the Lincoln Memorial. And this is the U.S. government's explanation, published by the U.S. government itself, of the meaning of the Lincoln Memorial. Okay. And so I thought, well, that's interesting. Maybe I should include that in my new book on Lincoln. I didn't cite this in any of the other ones. I'll write about this. So what is this true meaning? So the government says it's represented by a, quote, ubiquitous symbol that is all over the monument, inside and out. A ubiquitous symbol all over the place in the Lincoln Memorial. And what is this symbol? It's the fasces, F-A-S-C-E-S. It's where the word fascism comes from, the fasces. Okay, now what is the fasces? It's, and I'm quoting from this publication, a bundle of rods bound together by a leather thong. Okay, and the government says, the National Park Service says, this represents, quote, the higher meaning of the memorial and the man. The fasces, and it was a symbol of the Roman Empire, the fasces. Okay. And so that's the, and it's on the inside and the outside, the Lincoln Memorial, although they Americanized it by putting cute little eagles on the top of it. So you got the bundle of rods with a cute little eagle up there. Isn't that part of the song "I'm a Good Old Rebel"? And it's about the ugly eagle. Isn't that part of the lyrics of that? That's all over the Lincoln Memorial. Okay, so the National Park Service also says this. Where am I here? Okay, yeah, the fasces was originally the Roman Empire symbol. It was used as, quote, a symbol of power and authority. You see where this is a little different than Jefferson's language that I just used, power and authority. I'm still quoting them. It says, it represented that a man held imperium or executive authority. And in exercising that authority, a leader could expect his orders to be obeyed. He could dole out punishment to those who disobeyed him and could even execute those who disobeyed. That's in the Roman Empire. And they said, well, that's the Lincoln, who decided that's what we need to put on the Lincoln Memorial? That's what the Lincoln Memorial means. That'd be a good question. I'm not sure who exactly did this, because it was 100 years ago, 1922, that it was completed. Okay, now that man, of course, is Lincoln. And so if you look at this statement that, authority, dole out punishment to those who didn't obey, well, the hell with the consent of the government then. The government's just powers don't derive from the consent of the government anymore, do they? They derive from authority. And if you disobey, the authority has a right to punish you, is what they're saying. This is the official government publication. Okay. Now, there's an especially charming passage in this publication here that says, the executive authority represented by the fasces was often enforced in history by beatings and beheadings, if need be. Beatings and beheadings. Isn't that charming? I wonder if they teach your children that when you send them on the school trip to Washington, D.C. and go in the Lincoln Memorial. They talk about beatings and beheadings. They should. Okay. They would if I was a tour guide. Okay. And I'm still quoting about the fasces, because the fasces that are quote depicted all throughout the Lincoln Memorial imply government power, strength, authority, and justice. So I guess if you use power, authority, and strength, that is strength to enforce orders, as long as you put justice in there some way, it's okay. Because that's the goal, justice. They're only seeking justice, and that's the only. So the ends justify the means. As long as it's for justice, then that's okay. Anything goes. That's my interpretation of what's being said here. Okay, justice. Okay, now the purpose of this power is to exert authority over the citizens, they say. And so basically what they're saying, the way I read this, is that the symbol is that the American people are no longer the masters, but rather the servants of the state, with all this talk about power, authority, and threats to punish you if you don't obey authority, and on and on and on. Okay. Now, consider the time period where this happened, 1922. And when I was reading this and writing this up, one of the weirder things I've done in my research career was I was interested in writing a book on fascism years ago. So I read up on fascism. I read all these books, all these old books on fascism written by the fascists, and I never did write that book. Paul Gottfried has written several very good books on the topic, but I never did. I wrote a couple of articles on it, but I never got this book finished. Although it did allow me to write a Wall Street Journal article when Clinton came into power. I'll tell you a story about that. And so this is a long time ago that I was reading up on fascism. When Clinton came in, he was wanted to campaigned about health care, and it was called Hillary Care then, not Obamacare. It was called Hillary Care then. And he and his wife went on and on and on about we need to do something about health care, but no details at all. That's typical politician, no details at all. And he finally made a speech where they laid out their plan. I was sitting there, and a light bulb went off in my head. This sounds familiar, because their plan was they wanted to have 7 political appointees, and one's in charge of the nursing business, and the other's in charge of doctor training. So it'd be central planning of the whole medical system, of everything. The 7 political appointees, and then they would set up bureaucracies. There would be the nursing bureaucracy, and the doctor training bureaucracy, and the X-ray technician bureaucracy. They would have different bureaucracies in charge of different aspects of healthcare. And I'm listening to this. Where have I heard of this before? And it turns out it was almost a carbon copy of Mussolini's Italy, of how Mussolini's, and Hitler for that matter, set up fascist economics. Not the rest of it, but the economic fascism. They divided each industry up into Mussolini called them cooperatives. There might have been a steel industry cooperative and an insurance industry cooperative, but they were all run by government at the top. They allowed private enterprise to exist, but they were controlled like puppets on a string by government authorities. So anyway, I wrote an article for the Wall Street Journal, and what was the title was something like the Italian origins of Clinton's healthcare plan, something like that. And the whole article was, I quoted all these Italians about how they're going to set up their economy, and then I quoted next to it what Clinton just said, and it was just the same, exactly the same thing. And I was quoting books with titles like "Under the Axe of Fascism," heavy-handed title like that. And at the very end, the last paragraph, I revealed who I was quoting. I just said, these Italians, once said that. And so at the very end, I revealed it was all these fascists. And the Wall Street Journal published it at the top of the page right there. And the Clinton administration even got Franco Modigliani, who was a Nobel Prize-winning economist, to write a response to the Wall Street Journal. And Modigliani, who grew up in Italy under Mussolini, tried to out-Italian me by his, I grew up in there. I'm from Italy. I grew up there. But he ended up saying that Clinton won't make the same mistake that Mussolini did, and that Mussolini delegated too much power, and Bill Clinton is not going to do that. So, and then Mussolini really caught it after that. The Wall Street Journal published like dozens of responses to that baloney in there. But and so that's how fascism in the 20s. This idea, fascism was as acceptable to a lot of people, and not just the Italians and the Germans. And in the course of this research that I did, I read Mussolini's autobiography, which is kind of funny, because it reminded me of like if you got like an elementary school class and you said, okay, kids, the assignment for this week is we're going to write your autobiography. I know you're only 7 years old, you're only 8 years old, you just learned how to write, but let's have an autobiography, and you give it a title. Mussolini's autobiography is called My Autobiography. But he had a ghostwriter. The ghostwriter was the American ambassador to Italy. Richard Washburn Child was his name. And if you read up on Richard Washburn Child, the write-ups sound like, oh, he was a brilliant Harvard graduate, of course, Harvard Law School, of course, so therefore he's a genius. And he was a famous speechwriter, the magazine, the Saturday Evening Post, a big writer. He wrote for about 5 or 6 years, he wrote articles in praise of fascism in a Saturday Evening Post in the 1920s. And he became the ambassador to Italy, the American ambassador to Italy. And he was sort of a poster boy for a ruling class of America. And he worked for in the U.S. Treasury during World War I as a PR flack for Warren Harding, and Harding rewarded him for also being a campaign propagandist with the ambassadorship to Italy, because he knew he was so infatuated with Mussolini and fascism. So why don't you go over there? And he became Mussolini's confidant and speechwriter and biographer. Okay. And so he boasted of talking Mussolini into his famous March on Rome, as well as that. And so this is the ruling class elite of America in the early 1920s, openly advocating fascism in the Saturday Evening Post. So it's not unusual that these same people who built the Lincoln Memorial, this is who they were. This is who they were. They were, Mussolini. Winston Churchill said that if I had been an Italian, I would have donned the fascist black shirt. Mussolini's thugs wore black shirts. It was, it was like early Antifa, I guess. Was his thugs, and this was, this was long before Hitler and Mussolini got together and became their bromance between the two of them, and so even Winston Churchill said that, and let's see, one other thing I have here, and also. There's a book, among people like myself, free market economists like myself. One of the old books about Franklin Roosevelt is called The Roosevelt Myth by John T. Flynn. John T. Flynn is considered to be a member of the old right, the old conservative movement. And here's what he said about Mussolini and FDR. Okay, and FDR's New Deal of the 1930s. Mussolini organized each trade or industrial group or professional group into a state-supervised trade association. Like I said, the insurance association, the steel industry, and so forth. He called it a cooperative. These cooperatives operated under state supervision and could plan production, quality, prices, distribution, labor standards, etc. The NRA, that is the National Recovery Administration that FDR put into place, provided that in American industry, each industry should be organized into a federally supervised trade association. It was not called a cooperative, it was called a code authority, but it was essentially the same thing. This was fascism. And this is true, the NRA was fascism. It was almost a carbon copy of what Mussolini did in Italy, which is why Bill Clinton's plan for Hillary Care was also the same model. The same model, basically. So some things never change. Politicians are not very imaginative when it comes to these things, are they? They know how to acquire power, and that's what they're going to do, no matter who it's been tainted by. And so if you consider these things, it's not too outlandish to think that the U.S. government at the time, in the early 1920s, or even was infatuated by some of these ideas. And I don't know whose idea it was to put all the fasces all over the Lincoln Memorial, but they're there, and they'll be there until we got to get that same college student who called the Cornell University president to call Biden and complain about the Lincoln Memorial, maybe. And maybe they'll dynamite the thing down, okay? And so that's what our government tells us is the true meaning of the Lincoln Memorial, and it could not possibly be any different than the Jefferson Memorial. Diametrically opposed, exactly the opposite meaning of these two men and these two memorials, and they pretend that they're sort of twins on different sides of that part of the mall in Washington, D.C. And so the Lincoln myth, as I've said 10,000 times, is the ideological cornerstone of the American state. That's one of the reasons. That's one of the things that gets me going and keeps me going, writing these books and articles and things like that. And but this is what the government says it means now. It means like we became basically the Roman Empire, an American version, not of British mercantilism, but more like the Roman Empire with Lincoln. And so that's about my story for now, and I'm sticking to it.